because you have all these commodities that would have been very difficult to get, or you would have had to make before, are now very cheap and easily mass produced. A negative side effect is if you that picture up on the right, which is a little thing called tenement living. Because these cities are growing so quickly, they don't have anywhere to put these people. So you have a lot of people in a very small amount of space, and there's no regulation on it. There's no way to control it. So you have diseases are getting spread, and it's just not a good situation to be living in. Another positive, however, is there's an economic boom for the whole country. So you have, because now the country has a lot of things to export, to be selling, and you also have a lot of import from the colonies, which have all of your raw materials. So there's a really good trade going back and forth from mainland England to the rest of the colonies and the rest of the world. And then, unfortunately, the working class was underpaid. Like I said, there's no regulation. This situation has never happened before in history, so they have no way to control it. They just don't know what to do. So all these people are underpaid and overworked, and people are getting sick and dying and living in not great conditions, and they just, at this point, have no way to get a handle on that because you don't have unions and you don't have government regulation. One thing that occurred because of these bad situations is you kind of see the power of what written word can do. Because it's being mass-produced now, it gets out, there's a bigger middle class, and a lot of things happen due to that. You have authors like Charles Dickens and Emily Barrett Browning who just sort of take it and they point it out, like we discussed in somebody's presentation last time. They're not really saying how we can fix it, but they're bringing it to the attention of people who might otherwise just sort of pass by all these lower class workers who are living in these terrible conditions. So you'll probably recognize Oliver Twist and Great Expectations as one you might have read in high school. And so Dickens was very big into, look out for the little man, these people are going through a hard time. And then so was Emily Barrett Browning, who was a poet at the time. And then some people, like Karl Marx and Frederick Engels, they presented ideas. You're getting new ideologues coming out with how should the government do this, or should the government do anything? And this is where you start to get the rise of communism and socialism. They're very popular ideas at the time because it seems like, hey, the government's in control, they can just give us these things. Whether or not that works is debatable, but not the right presentation for that talk. And then, like I mentioned this before about the empire, that they're importing goods, raw materials from colonies, and then they're exporting the created materials back out into the colonies. You may have heard the phrase, the sun never sets, on the British Empire, and she mentioned it in class. This term is metaphorical. You're talking about the British Empire will never end, it's this really great idea, we're so wonderful. It's also literal, which is kind of interesting. Because if you look at this, all of the red in these pictures is owned by Britain at the time. That is all of Canada, that's all of Australia. At no point in the day is the sun not shining somewhere in the British Empire. Which is kind of an interesting point. All right. So this is where your imperial age comes in, where everybody's going out and getting colonies. So in theory, imperialism is a really great thing. There's a lot of rhetoric going on about how we're the superior race, so we have to go out and help the other ones. No, the idea that we're the superior race comes from evolution, which is a very new theory. Charles Darwin's just come out and is talking about this. So it becomes this it's our imperative. We have to go out and we have to help these people. We're doing good. And there's also a very religious aspect to it. You have a lot of missionaries going out at the time, and they're preaching to these native people who have never heard the word of God before. They've had no opportunity to. So there's a very religious and sort of noble ideas embedded in the entire theory of imperialism. However, in reality, it's not such a great thing. The good that everybody's talking about doesn't really happen. Most of the colonized peoples, they don't have the civil liberties. England was known for at the time, that you can't vote, you can't participate, you can't help set up your own government. You're ruled by white people who are telling you what to do. They don't have to pay you if they don't want to. They can't beat you. Nobody's really speaking for them. And you also have a lot of war is involved, not only overtaking the colonies, but also in keeping them. Kipling, when he was younger, lived through the Boer War, which is a situation that was not pretty. All of the British armies were pretty badly defeated by these really native sort of guerrilla tactics, which was very shocking to them because they're the superior race and they have the better way of life. And then also is the economic situation. Although as a whole the empire is booming, for the little people, for the native people, it's not going well. It's probably worse in some situations than the people living in the cities in the tenements. So, in all of this, you get Kipling. He is born in India. He's the son of middle class parents in India. His father is a teacher at a college. She teaches art and architecture. And he lives there until he's about 6, and then his family ships him back up to Britain, which was pretty common because there weren't schools for him to attend in India. So he lives there for a while, but he really loved being in India. It affects a lot you see it in a lot of his work, and sort of the exotic surroundings and the stories that he's hearing from the native peoples. Like I said, at 6, he goes to England for school, and there he lives with a foster family named the Holloways. And I don't have a whole lot of detail about what happened in this time, but pretty much everything says he was really miserable there. The family didn't like him much. He didn't really get along with them. So it was pretty depressing for young Kipling. But then, fortunately, at 12, he leaves the foster family and he goes to a boarding school called the United Services College. And there, his teachers, and especially one of his headmasters, notices his talent for writing, and they really help to foster that. And he sort of starts to come out of his shell there. Many years later, he'll write a book of short stories called Stocky and Company, which is actually based on his experiences there, and it's one of his earlier, more popular pieces, and it's especially popular among young schoolboys who are living in a lot of the same situations that he's describing, which is just schoolboys having fun, getting in trouble. Good times had by all. As he starts writing, at age 16, he goes back to India with his parents, so he's not in school for very long, but he gets a job right away, and he works as a journalist on 2 different papers. One of them, can I go back? Yes. First, he works up in Lahore, way up there, which is a little red dot, if you can't see it, which is where his parents were living. And then he sort of becomes the editor of that paper by default, and it's a lot of work. He works really long, hard hours, and he writes stories on the side. So he's working a lot, and then he moves back down to Allahabad when another job opportunity comes up for him to work on a different, larger paper that's circulated throughout India. And for that, he does some editing, and he writes a lot of stories for their larger editions. So his stories and poetry are being published now. Then in 1889, so quite a few years later, he moves back up to England and starts publishing his work in collections, in anthologies, instead of just like one at a time. And his first one is Barrack Room Ballads, which is a really big success. Like, that's when people first start to notice that, hey, this guy's really good, we should buy more of his stuff. And then in 1892, he marries that lady down there who is Carrie Ballatier, I think it's Ballatier, who is the sister of his best friend, Wolcott, who had died not long before, which is kind of a weird thing that I notice happens. Poets keep marrying their best friend's sisters. I don't know. I wouldn't want to marry my best friend's brother, but okay. There's an interesting kind of history with that relationship. They have a difficult marriage. They don't get along a lot of the time. They never get divorced. They stay together. They have 3 kids, but a lot of people view them as on the outside as not being a great marriage. But somebody from the Kipling Society, which are people who study and like Kipling a lot, they just came out with a book called The Hated Wife, which talks about Carrie and their relationship.
And he says that even though outwardly they didn't really seem to get along, she's kind of the backbone of the relationship, because Kipling, even though he talks about in his work, he talks about being that sort of naturalistic attitude and you have to be strong and be the backbone, he wasn't so much in his personal life. He didn't really go out, he didn't want to have those confrontations, but Carrie would do that for him. So there's a weird dynamic in their relationship that I guess works because they stay together. After they get married, they move to Vermont, here in America, and Kipling intends to settle down there, and they really like it, and they have their first 2 children, and he publishes some more books, including Captain's Courageous, which is that one, and The Jungle Book, which if you've heard of anything by Kipling, it's probably that one. And he also publishes the sequel to The Jungle Book. Unfortunately, he has a big fight with his brother-in-law, not the dead one, obviously, but a different brother-in-law. And it's apparently very public and not a good situation, and they actually move all the way back to England because of that. While they're in England, the first place they live is in that house, and they live there quite a while. It's in Rottingdean, which is in the county of Sussex. If you know anything about England, that's where it is. And they have a happy life there. He does a lot of writing during this time, which is a pretty extended period of time, including Kim, which a lot of people consider to be his best work, which is a story about, again, set in India, about an English child living in India. So there's a lot of sort of his life built into that. He kind of gets the name of the People's Laureate, which is a little bit ironic because he does not accept an offer to be the official laureate of England, and he also does not accept a knighthood, which is kind of interesting. I think it says something about him as a person and what he cares about in the world, because if I were offered a knighthood, I'd take that. Then, unfortunately, they go on another visit to America in 1899, and his daughter dies, and a lot of things, it seems, really changed.